So one of the things that got everyone upset about the Gillette ad, and I would say rightfully so, was the toxic masculinity word they threw in a few seconds in. And there was an interesting poll I saw in a group I'm in not soon after. You can see down at the bottom left here, does toxic masculinity exist? If yes, what is your definition? And that was something that was discussed in the comments. And as you can see, the vast majority of people said no, and a few people said yes. And there were some people that didn't really choose either, and you can see that I chose no for a reason I'll explain. But looking through the comments section, it was interesting to see the people that said no and the people that said yes actually did pretty much agree on everything. I found that very interesting, that we were all on the exact same page, even though we gave different answers. And that brings me to going through the actual definition, the nuance of it. I kind of want to cover a single term as in-depth as I possibly can, because I think it's a buzzword for a certain reason. It's something we have to go through and really figure out why that is. So when it comes to the idea of toxic masculinity, the first thing you have to do is define your terms. What does it actually mean? Because believe me, if you've ever been in a debate with anyone about anything at all that can be summed up in a single word, make sure you define your terms. Because I cannot tell you how many debates I have listened to or even participated in the past where by the end it was pretty clear that both people were talking completely past each other. Nothing was resolved at all because the two people were arguing on one topic for which they had two different definitions of. So when it comes to toxic masculinity, I think we have to understand, like, what does it actually mean? How do people define it? Are there different definitions? And as you can see right here, you can define it in two different ways. Some in two ways that I've seen used by in different times and by different sets of people. Now, the general definition, the one that I think is the least common, is the behavioral effects of testosterone. Is masculinity? So masculinity is associated with it's the behavior, I guess, of men. What defines the behavior of men as opposed to women? Well, pretty much testosterone, the male hormone. But I've seen another definition as well, which is man's role in society, what he should strive to achieve. And that's the definition I hear by people who advocate for masculinity, the people that actually say how to be a man, like the art of manliness. If you've ever heard of that, I think it's a blog. I know it's an email list because I somehow got on there and I haven't really unsubscribed because they actually put out good stuff every so often. But yeah, it's more of an idea of what men should be. The idea of, like, when they say man up, they're not saying get more testosterone. When they're saying man up, they're not saying be more biologically male. They're saying, when they say man up, they mean get over it, like deal with it, like deal with your problems, that kind of thing. So when it comes to people actually talking about what it means to be a man, they're focusing less on the behavioral, the biological part of it, and more on the goal, the ideal. Actually, that's something to really worth pointing out, the ideal, specifically. And the third definition is just what I got off of Wikipedia, a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles associated with boys and men, which kind of fits into both the first two, I would think. A set of behaviors and roles, I mean, you could say that's something that could be influenced by biology, like attributes, something that's men's behavior, or as well, they said roles, which is I find interesting because roles fits more with the second definition of, like I said, man's role in society. Now on to the second part, does it actually exist? Because going back to that poll, the people that put no, which is something I'm actually going to switch the two here, the people that put no, myself included, use the second definition. So if we're talking about manliness, we're talking about confidence, chivalry, self-control, the idea of manning up, the idea of dealing with your problems, the whole idea of, like, in contrast not to femininity, but in contrast to being a boy, which I found interesting. Like, boys aren't men in the sense that when you're a boy, you're still immature, you're a child, like you have childlike behavior. But when you grow up, when you become a man, as the phrase is, when you become a man, that's when you really grow up. You become mature, you become confident, you're in control of your surroundings, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're going out and accomplishing things. That is what manliness, masculinity is meant to be in the sense of the second definition. And under that definition, no, toxic masculinity does not exist because all of those things are good things. If you view it as the ideal role of what it means to be a man, then sure, like then sure, all that stuff is good because that is the ideal. And to say that toxic masculinity would exist would be to say that those things are bad, that confidence, self-control, that essentially what our society views as good for men is bad, is to say that toxic masculinity exists. But under definition 1, which again, I should have put I should have reversed them. But under definition 1, the behavioral effects of testosterone, then sure, like there are bad behaviors that are more specific to men. As you can see, I don't have the stats on hand. I found a few different ones, but generally, like, men are more, like, if you look at prisons, they're disproportionately male. Why? Because men are more often like the burglars, the thieves, the murderers, the rapists. Like, they're all disproportionately male because that is just something that is with being a man. That is something that our biology disproportionately leads us to, as opposed to women. Women have their own sets of bad behaviors that they're disproportionately leading to. Like, for example, just when you're talking about bad behaviors among men and women, men tend to be like more forceful. Men their behaviors are more just violence, whereas women's behaviors are more going behind people's backs, like backstabbing, spreading lies, and like that's kind of the where that fits in as to being awful, as specific to the two genders. But I find that interesting. Under that definition, the behavioral effects of testosterone, sure, like testosterone, if you're someone that's hyped up on testosterone and you do not have the manliness of the second definition, you're like, you have no self-control at all, like you're a complete hedonist, then sure, like sexual assault, bullying and stuff, that is stuff that is disproportionately, actually I should have probably taken bullying out of it, now that I think about it, but something like assault, that is something that is disproportionately male. And under the definition 1, yes, there is in a sense a toxic masculinity in the sense of male behaviors. There is a certain subset of bad behaviors. That's what the people that said yes, there is such thing as toxic masculinity were using. They were using that definition and saying there are behaviors that are disproportionately like specific to men that are bad. But just to give I don't which one's the right definition, I don't really know. I go with definition 2 in that there is no toxic masculinity, just because that's the one I see more common. That's the one that generally the people that advocate for masculinity use. That's the one that, at least in Western culture, I think is the more common one. So on the third thing, why is it a buzzword? No, why did that give people such a bad reaction in the Gillette ad? Even though it was just one word, just thrown in the background there. Why was it so bad? Well, as I listed here, only one ideology uses that term and defines it as the second definition. And that tends to be like the far leftists, the Marxists, the radical feminists, third wave feminists. They're the ones that use the phrase toxic masculinity, and they define it as definition number 2, the one that I think any rational person normally would say there is no such thing as toxic masculinity. They would say that under they use the second definition as masculinity is, again, like the ideal, like what a man is expected to be within our culture. That's what they use. And they see that as a bad thing. That's where the problem is. Because if you're using the phrase toxic masculinity, you're probably not complaining about sexual assault or bullying and that. You're just going to say, yeah, that stuff's bad. We all accept that's bad. Like, whatever. That's something that you don't even have to say is bad because it's so obvious. And even the people that do it will later like come up with excuses for it and stuff. And that doesn't dismiss them at all. But even they kind of know it's bad. But they do it anyway. It's kind of like stealing and murder and that kind of stuff. Everyone kind of accepts it's bad, but the people that do it will find a way to justify it. And obviously they're awful people, but that's something where you don't really have to say it's bad because it's just such a given. And the issue here is with the word toxic masculinity, why it gives such a negative reaction to most people, or at least people disproportionately on the right, is because when they are talking about toxic masculinity, they are not talking about sexual assault or bullying. They are talking about what it means to be a man in the 21st century Western culture in terms of, like I listed earlier in the second definition of chivalry, like just more self-confidence, that like the kind of behavior that men aspire to be, basically. They see that as a bad thing, and that's why this is such a bad term, because with their problem comes all kinds of solutions that are atrocious, that are absolutely bad. Like, the one thing that I've seen the biggest issue with is the idea of kind of looking at men and trying to I would say feminize them in a sense. I'll explain in a second. But more that they're looking at what it is to be a man through a female lens, and that you can't do that. That's just as you can't look at females and look at things through a male lens. It's just not going to work. And by the lenses, I mean like women talk about their feelings a lot, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's something that women are interested in. As you can see, they go into healthcare fields more because they go into caretaking fields more because they enjoy that stuff. That's something that they disproportionately have a preference for. When it comes to like they like, I don't want to call it drama, but they do like drama, but just human interaction, that kind of stuff. Relationships, they like that stuff. The fictional novels they read, like it's all down to, they talk a lot about human relationships and interaction and resolving like conflict resolution through talking to one another and that kind of stuff. Like that's what women are disproportionately into. And again, that's not a good thing or a bad thing. That just is. That's just a fact of reality. And I think the issue is when a lot of like third wave feminists, when a lot of like feminist psychologists, when a lot of people on the far left, and honestly the moderate left even, when they look at men through the female lens, they see, oh, well, men aren't talking about their feelings enough. Men are being taught by masculinity to bottle it all up because masculinity is all about bottling up your feelings and dealing with it in the sense of getting over it, not necessarily processing it, but just getting over it is what they say. And the issue with that is, this is actually something from Christina Hoff Sommers. I couldn't find the exact statistic or the exact quote, but it's from The War Against Boys, the book. It's a good book. I recommend you read it. But she did reference that. And if you ever hear her give a speech on the war against boys, she does include that in her speech as well. But what she essentially says is, like, you talk to these men, and you talk to men on average, and young boys too, about them bottling up their feelings, and you're trying to get them to open up. You put them through therapy. You try to get them to talk about their problems and talk about their feelings. And the issue isn't that men are bottling up. It's just that men don't care. Like, if you talk to men and boys in that, when you try to use therapy in terms of talking about your emotions and that, men are like, this is the most boring thing ever. I don't care about talking about my feelings. I'd rather do something else. Like, whereas women generally want to do that. They want to vent. They want to talk about how they feel. And again, like, that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. Men, on average, just don't want to talk about that stuff. Obviously, I'm talking about averages. There are exceptions to the rule. But men in general, there's actually something I learned in, was it lifespan development, a class I took in college. It's actually a good video called "It's Not the Nail," that it takes a satirical look at it. It's actually quite funny. It's like 2 minutes, I think, on like men dealing with problems versus women dealing with problems. And generally, women, when they have a problem, what they want to do is they'll feel better if they get not sympathy but empathy. Like, they want to talk about how it makes them feel about their problem, the fact that they have a problem. That's what they want to talk about, and They want to talk. That's something they would feel better if they were to talk about the problem. And that's where therapy works. Like, talking about your problems works. Whereas men tend to be just like, I don't want to talk, I just want to fix it. Like, and obviously I'm biased towards the one because that's how I am. Like, I don't care about talking about a problem. I just want to fix the problem. Like, I don't want to, every second that I'm spending talking about a problem is a second I'm not fixing the problem. So, like, when it comes to me having a problem, if you're going to sit someone down with me and talk to me about it, like, that doesn't help me. That doesn't interest me. I just want to fix it. And, like, if you're going to sit down and tell me ways to fix it or come up with ideas how to fix it, great. Like, that's awesome. But if you're here just to say, how does that make you feel? I'm just going to say, this is boring. I'd rather do something else. And that's just how it is. And that's the big problem with the, that was just one example, honestly. That's the big issue when it comes to the people that view masculinity as toxic. They're saying, oh, men are bottling up their feelings, when the reality is, it's like, men just don't care. And the reaction to that might be, well, men just don't care because they've been socialized this way. Our culture is pushing masculinity to men in a toxic way that makes them different, that makes them more violent, that makes them bottle up their feelings. And it's like, no, that's just biology. That's just how it works. That's been tested over and over and over again. And that's just the data that overall, that's just how men are biologically. They care more about fixing problems. They don't care about talking about their feelings. And I can't say this without showing my obvious preference for the one because I am male. I like that. That's just how I am, and that's how most people are on average. If you're like how most men are on average. But That's really what it comes down to, is just understanding the differences, and that there are differences. Because the people that talk about toxic masculinity, they also complain about, like, men sitting, or not men, but boys in class, boys roughhousing in recess and that, and they'll get in, like, the roughhousing fights and that, and they're not actual fights, they're like play fights. There's an obvious line there. There's a line that's not even really talked about, because it's so obvious that it's like, okay, if two men or two boys are playing out at recess and one of them gets hurt, or one of them's being a little bit violent, it's like, well, that's just how it is. And violence is even the wrong word for it, because it's really not violent. Like, it's just playing. It's something that obviously, if someone were to actually get hurt, and I remember that from elementary school, that we got hurt all the time, and if one of us, like, got seriously hurt, it was entirely by accident. For one, no one meant to hurt someone else that badly, and two, it was like, okay, stop, like, let's take a second, make sure everyone's okay, like, are you good? Like, okay, good. And that's essentially how it was. And that's the issue, is the people that use the phrase toxic masculinity view that as a bad thing. They view men playing as, like, just expressing violence, and that needs to be socialized out of them. And then they look at public schools, for example, and you'll see that the issue with public schools is that they're like, okay, sit down, shut up, sit still, don't say anything, we're going to learn about stuff. If you want to say something, raise your hand. And generally, it's an environment where boys, on average, do not learn. It just does not help them that much. And generally, women, I actually had an article that I'll leave a link in the description, where I was going through this about brain differences. The differences, because you can actually look at a brain, and not look just at an actual brain, but do different measurements of it, of like white matter versus gray matter size, that kind of thing. And you can generally see, okay, you can identify if this were a male or a female brain based on just based on its composition. That's the word I'm looking for. Based on its composition. And you'll find a little bit of differences, where essentially sitting down in a classroom and listening, auditory learning, as opposed to visual or kinesthetic, actually doing things with your hands and building things, you'll find that auditory learning, sitting in a classroom, I mean, it's not really great for anyone, really. I don't think that's a good learning style in general. But for women, it's disproportionately great for them. It's fine for them. They're comfortable with doing that. They're comfortable with sitting down, sitting still, and just learning and listening. Whereas men, I keep saying men, but I mean boys, they just don't, that's just not how it works for them. They get fidgety, they move, and I know I did that a lot. Like, I fidgeted a lot. Like, I didn't like sitting in a classroom. That I was not very auditory. I'm a very visual learner, and that was something where they see obviously disproportionate issues with boys, because they can't sit still, they need to move, and that's where you get the whole, oh, they just need meds. Like, the problem isn't that the boys will be boys, as they say. The problem is, oh, they just need meds to calm them down, and they're clearly dysfunctional in that way. And it's like, no, that's not how it is at all. It's just that they both learn differently. That's the naturally occurring thing. That's just how it works. And it's neither a good thing or a bad thing. When it becomes excessive, sure, like when it becomes such an issue, when it's on such an extreme scale that they literally cannot, like, sit down and sit still for even a second, then yeah, that's when it becomes an issue. But for the most part, it's just different learning styles, different personalities and that, and it's fine. But I've been going on this part for a bit too long, but really that's what it comes down to, is that the reason toxic, I can if you want to make an argument that toxic masculinity exists, okay, that's fine, but I'm going to assume, I'm going to need you to define your terms, and I will agree with you if you're using the first definition, and that masculinity is just behaviors of men, because there are bad behaviors that men have. But I think most people define it in the second way, and the people that were using the phrase toxic masculinity define it in the second way. They're saying what it means to be a man in today's age is a bad thing. Like, the people that are advocating masculinity, the people that are advocating, like, growing up and being mature, and, like, obviously they wouldn't use those words, or the feminists wouldn't use those words to describe what masculinity is, but they tend to follow under the second definition of what the ideal man is. They don't like. They have an issue with. They think that's all socialized into them, and it's not a reflection of actual biology. It's something that really boys have disproportionately effective behavior, or have disproportional behaviors in certain ways that are different from women, and masculinity in our society is kind of using that to an advantage, playing on the strengths and working on the weaknesses. in terms of, like we already went through, if you have a boy with no father figure that was never taught anything about being masculine or growing up or being mature, and they lack any sort of self-control, sure, they can wreak havoc. They can be awful. They can be pretty bad in ways that a woman wouldn't be as bad if they didn't have like a father figure. But the issue is not that they have too much masculinity. It's the fact that they don't have enough. It's that they didn't have that father figure to really instill into them masculinity, and as is defined by the people that actually advocate for it. So the last half of this video was a bit rambly, I get, but hopefully this was helpful in really trying to look at the nuance of this. I'm trying to look at this in the most just non-biased way as possible, in sort of giving a bit of sort of explaining the opponent's terms in a way that hopefully was not a straw man, but that's the way I've seen it. That's where the big issue lies, and that if you're gonna say, like, first thing you got to do is define your terms, and it seems that most people are on board with the second definition, and that's where the big disagreement is of those values, like the values that people advocate for when they say be a man. I see as a good thing. Lots of people see as a good thing. The people that use the phrase toxic masculinity, like the radical feminists, see that as a bad thing, and that's where the issue is. Not only do they see it as a bad thing, but their solutions are also atrocious. They're awful. They don't want. They're not out to fix anything in a good way. But hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully this clears up any misconceptions about it. If you disagree, if you have a different definition, if you thought neither of these definitions were very helpful or accurate to yours, let me know what yours is. Because obviously there's how many billions of people in this planet. Clearly there's going to be more than 2 definitions, but I'm thinking these were the 2 big ones. Those were the 2 at least that I have heard about the most. And when going through that poll earlier, as I saw at the bottom left here, most people went through, or actually everyone, listed either 1 or 2 of those definitions when I asked them, like how do you define masculinity? So that's what it comes down to. And hopefully I'll leave a link to everything in the description that I referenced, that I found data for. Also, The War Against Boys, read that as well, by Christina Hoff Sommers. That's where a lot of that smacks down this whole idea of toxic masculinity. It's a great book. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. Hit the subscribe button for more stuff like this. And thanks for watching.